Yes, morning everyone. Thank you for joining our workshop today. So this is the second in a series of workshops that the GOV.UK design system team have been running in preparation for the new version of WCAG. And today we're going to be focusing on the target size criterion. So as I just mentioned, yes, we're recording the session today. Feel free to take screenshots of the slides, but not of your fellow attendees. And we will be sharing the transcript and the video after the session as well. Just to introduce myself, my name is Kelly Lee. I'm the delivery manager on the GOV.UK design system team, and I will just hand over to my co-host today, David, to introduce himself.
Hey there. Yep, my name is David, and I'm going to be facilitating. I don't know if there's much more to say.
So yeah, this is a safe space for learning. Please be kind and feel free to speak openly. We do have a code of conduct in place today, which will be shared in the chat. And just some important pieces of context for this workshop. We are not the experts. We may not have all the right answers today, but we'll do our best to answer your questions that you do have. Our team doesn't own or write the accessibility guidelines. And if you do notice something that we say that isn't right, please feel free to bring it up when there is space. And we are here to encourage positive discussion and conversation. A few bits of meeting hygiene before we get started in the main workshop. Please stay on mute unless you are talking, and use the raise hand feature on Zoom and the reactions menu during discussion times. So you can find out more information about our team's events that we host by joining our mailing list. We'll also share a link to that mailing list, the sign up link in the chat too. So I'm just going to quickly run through our plan for this morning's session. We're going to start off talking about WCAG 2.2 and this workshop series that we've been running. And then we're going to move on to talking about the target size criterion in particular, demonstrating an example, and then there'll be a group activity in breakout rooms. After that activity has finished, we will regroup and discuss with the wider group, and then do a wrap up and retrospective. All of today's links and resources can be found in our workshop Google Doc, which the link will also be shared in the chat for that. And yeah, as mentioned before, our facilitators today are myself, David, and Charlotte, who is also here and will be helping moderate the chat and sharing links. So I am going to stop sharing now and hand over to David for the next part of the session.
So our plan for today has been set out, and now we're going to go into a bit of the educational learning portion of this. So if you attended our previous one of these sessions back a few weeks ago, this might be familiar, but for everyone else who's new, this will hopefully not be too familiar, although for many of you, this might just be things you already know. Hold on, there will be stuff that you maybe don't know coming later. Yeah, so what is WCAG 2.2 and why am I pronouncing it WCAG? So it's an acronym, first of all. So it stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And the big secret as to why I call it WCAG is because I find it easier than saying WCAG. It's basically a recommendation of things to do, different guidelines on how to make websites and web things, web content accessible. Right now, for the next version, which is version 2.2. So yeah, I've actually put, if you are following along in the slides or in the HTML version of the slides, I put a link in the sort of comment section for a full diff log of the changes between version 2.1 and 2.2, a giant HTML document that sort of shows all the differences. But the main things you got to know is that basically it's an expansion pack. So if you're into the gaming space, it's DLC, it's downloadable content for the accessibility guidelines. So there's more criteria to choose from in this one. There's an updated glossary of definitions to help sort of add extra nuance and clear things up. And there's also a last minute removal of one of the previous success criteria that was in there before. So I put the 9 potential new criteria on the screen here. So there's 9 added and then there's one removed. So 4.1.1 parsing rest in peace is one of the ones that's being retired from this due to basically updates to how technology works, especially web browsers. But yeah, so we have them there. You've got some at the AA level, which is sort of, I think, which most sort of companies and organizations look to meet. And then there's also a few new AAA ones, especially the two enhanced ones there. So we've got stuff like focus not obscured to do with if you have a focus, don't obscure it. Focus appearance, which is if you have a focus, make sure it appears well and is like seeable rather than just visible. Dragging movements, so that has to do with sort of any sort of click drag or tap and drag interactions, making sure there's sort of an alternative to those or they're just not used in general. Target size, so that's the one we're doing today. Consistent help, which is probably the easiest one to explain just from its name. So when there's help information, make sure it's consistently placed and ideally also easy to find, but I don't think that's part of it. Redundant entry, which is basically if you ask someone to enter something once, don't ask for it again unless there's reason to. If you do ask for it to, again, sort of add alternative ways to get it, like pre-autofilling it or being like, hey, this is the thing you entered before. Can we reuse that shipping address there? That sort of thing. And the last one is accessible authentication, which is sort of like a series of ways or methods to make the process of authentication, which could just mean signing in, could mean a little bit more. Still looking for some clarification on that. But basically when that's happening, when you're signing into something, it is accessible. Yeah, so right now WCAG 2.2 is scheduled to become a published W3C recommendation in August or September, potentially on the 4th of August, but that is not guaranteed. So it is a bit of a moving date, but maybe it won't move this time, who knows? But yeah, the UK government's accessibility monitoring body, since this is sort of targeted at people within the UK government, but also to the general public as well. So any service teams in the UK government that own services or websites, note that the monitoring body will start checking those services and websites against WCAG 2.2 a year after the recommendation is published. So if it goes in August, that would be August 2024. Our team, we're planning to update our code base and guidance within 6 months of WCAG 2.2 being published. The reason why we're aiming for sort of 6 months earlier than the regulations we've taken for our team is because a lot of services across government rely on our stuff being ready to go. And then they also need time to implement that on their services as well. So we have a code base for our design system, and that needs to sort of be ingested into everyone's individual services. Make sure you stay on mute if possible. I'm gonna turn off permissions for unmuting for the moment. But yes, and then we also have guidance that we have to show people sort of how to implement it beyond the things that we can do in code. So we can't really make help show up consistently on a page or in a service. So that's something that we add guidance on, and we are hoping to get it out 6 months earlier so that teams have at least 6 months to sort of implement with that. And about this workshop series. So it's been developed for a few different reasons. Reason one being that some of the criteria coming in WCAG 2.2 can be pretty complicated to test for. They take some level of in-depth inspection to them. Reason number two being that service teams within the UK government are going to need to do more than just update to the latest version of our code base to get the UK front end, like I just noticed, or like I just mentioned. So we want to be able to prepare teams for this, let them know what's coming. And then the third reason is we want to make sure that what we're doing on the Gov.UK design system matches sort of the ways that WCAG 2.2 is being interpreted in the broader community. So it's not going to be the best situation if everyone is using a different method to measure what meeting WCAG 2.2 means. So this is a chance for us to sort of share what we're thinking, share the ways that we're considering like testing for these different things, and ensure consistency across sort of ideally the UK government, but at the very least across the people in this room. So like we said before, if there is anything that we're getting inaccurate, feel free to use the raise hand feature or put in the chat and we'll capture that. And we can sort of do a bit of fact checking during this as well. We're happy to do that. There are 3 new WCAG criteria in WCAG 2.2 that we wanted to inspect in particular for this set of workshops. So that's focus not obscured, which already ran 3 weeks ago, target size is today, and focus appearance. There might be a slight tweak to that, still deciding on our side. So if you have thoughts, feel free to share them. But we might switch out that last one for accessible authentication instead, as we've realized it's sort of a whole suite of things that are slightly more complicated to implement. While the testing for it, the inspection portion isn't as complicated. The fixes and knowing sort of how far to go for accessible authentication can be daunting, to say the least. So today's workshop will be interactive and involves sort of discussion. We're taking notes on our side. We're going to ask folks to take notes in groups as well, a bit of hands-on inspection and also idea sharing. So in the spirit of that, we do encourage people to stick around for that portion, which will come sort of after this instructional learning portion. I think last time we had a 50% drop off at that point as people ran out of the room, which is totally fine. I get it. Not everyone wants to interact, but I'll note that for the people that stayed behind, I did get a lot of comments, just individually anecdotal, that it was very well worth it for people. And in my opinion, the reason why we're doing this workshop in the first place is for that hands-on interactive experience, because that's really where these ideas will start clicking, is when you're actually going through a page and trying this out yourself. All right, so we've talked a bit about WCAG 2.2, and we've mentioned target size, but what is it? What's going on there? What is this thing we're talking about? So I've got a set of a few slides here from the accessibility monitoring team, which is one of our sibling teams within the government digital service here. And then I'll go on to sort of a quick check version, and then I'll go into a deep dive version. So we've got 3 versions coming up of what target size is, and sort of pick which one works best for you and mix and match as needed. All right, so yes, target size in quotation marks, size, is a AA success criterion inside of WCAG 2.2. And essentially, it's saying that any sort of click targets, hit targets, anything like that, anything where it becomes an interactive element, that target area plus the spacing around it needs to be at least 24 pixels across and high as well. But yeah, so it says target size, but we've put the word quote, or the word size in quotes, because it's sort of a mix of the size of the target as well as the spacing for this criterion. So yes, moving on, here's an example on the screen. I'll describe it as well for people, which is an example of a carousel, which is basically a series of images in a row on a website, a potentially controversial component, but one that definitely exists in the real world. So yes, this one has sort of a pause button on the far left, and then 4 dots signifying each of the 4 pages. And the pause button is far enough away from the 4 dots that it's okay. It has sort of 24 pixels of space. I think actually it is also larger than 24 pixels in size, just based visually on what we're looking at there. But the sort of the dots to choose the different slides of it, the different pieces of the carousel, overlap a little bit in sort of a 24 pixel circle around it, 24 pixel diameter circle around the center of those dots. When you sort of line them all up with those circles, they overlap. So this would be under target size a fail. You could note that basically all of these controls are undersized. None of them are like really great for clicking, but because those dots are closer together, that's where the fail sort of starts coming up. But yeah, there's also a AAA version of target size that's pre-existing from at least WCAG 2.1, potentially WCAG 2.0 as well. And that one sort of recommends to put controls at 44 by 44 pixels, so slightly bigger. I'll go into depth a bit more later for that, but that's an important note as well, is that this is titled target size minimum, this new one coming in WCAG 2.2. So don't feel that you suddenly need to make all controls 24 pixels. Yeah, so ways to pass this target size criterion. So the quick and easy one is make targets at least 24 pixels high and 24 pixels wide. You've covered it all at that point. Congrats. But there are some other ways to do it as well that are sort of outlined here. So another common one is having an alternative control on the same page that passes. So say you've got like a zoom in, zoom out toggle sort of at the top left of an area, and then you've got a bigger like zoom in, zoom out somewhere else. That was not a great example, but basically, if the same controls are on the page twice or multiple times, and one of them sort of meets target size, then they say that's okay. I'll note with a caveat there, that would still be very frustrating from a usability standpoint, because that means that users have to figure out which control is big enough for them to use on the page. So while it does mean a WCAG 2.2 pass, think about it before you do anything like that, before you start using these exceptions. And then another one is smaller targets are also allowed if they're essential. So for example, the example given here is in a color picker, where you have sort of a color space of millions of pixels of different color. You can't really cram multiple colors into one pixel, and you can't really give 24 pixels to every color. So you kind of in a bind there. The same would be said for maps, where the location of something on a map is important to its context, its value, its meaning, all that. Moving on, we'll go to the quick check version. So this was developed for our team a few months ago, just to get everyone sort of ready for WCAG 2.2. But the quick check version is 3 bullet points. So if something on your page is interactive, smaller than 24 by 24 pixels, and in an area crowded with a bunch of interactive stuff, that's a clue. That doesn't necessarily mean you've failed WCAG 2.2. There could be other things going on, but if it sort of meets all 3 of those pieces, it's worth taking a closer look. It's worth doing a deep dive or doing, as we're talking about an inspection here, to figure out sort of what's going on there and if extra spacing or extra size for the target areas is needed. So yeah, if it's interactive, smaller than 24 by 24 pixels, and in an area crowded with interactive stuff. All right, take a quick breather before we go into the deep dive. This is basically the section where we'll give a bunch of extra context, a bunch of extra research, and sort of help understand why this is happening a little bit, as far as why target size is here and what it's intended to do. So there's generally, from what I could find, 3 cases when target size will come up. And I've tried to give explanations to them. I probably should have given visual helpers for each of these as well. My bad on that, but I'll try to explain them as best as I can. And feel free to ask questions if any of them are unclear. And we'll get to those later. So any sort of place where there's grids of small interactive elements, so a bunch of things crowded in the same space, and they're all sort of interactable. They have hit areas on them, target areas. That is sort of a case when target size will come up. Anything where there's a bunch of vertically stacked interactive elements. So a list of links that are really crowded together is an example. A menu, like a drop-down menu with a bunch of crowded options, comes up a lot. And then the third one is any place where there's small controls that overlap a larger interactive area. So that could be like a link, an individual link inside of a card component. The card is clickable for one thing, the link is clickable for a completely different thing. So I've got a bunch of examples for each of these. I think I won't read them all out. I'll just sort of pick a couple of them. So for that grid example, a good example for that is like date pickers or calendars, where you'll have each of the dates sort of in a grid in front of you. I think for many date pickers, there's a good chance each of these individual like interactive spots, each of those dates is bigger than 24 by 24 pixels, but it is a place where this could happen, where you run into them being too small to be interactable, especially if you're on a phone with a thumb trying to mash the screen to get the right date there. For stacked examples, I've got a few there. Maybe I'll go to one of the bottom ones here. Areas with dense with icons is one option for stacked examples. So you'll often see like at the bottom of pages, maybe like 8 or 9, so maybe not that many, like 4 social media sort of icons all sort of in a row. And yeah, and then other options are, yeah, once again, like drop-down menus, like I mentioned, where you open it and there's a bunch of stacked examples there, and they're all sort of touching up against each other. For the overlap controls examples, we've got sort of expand or zoom icons that are maybe in like the top left of an image or an interactive piece like that. So in a map potentially. We've got show hide pieces sometimes where there might be a show / hide button inside of a bigger element. For example, show or hide password, if that button is embedded inside of the password input field, that has to be at least 24 pixels because it's a different interaction there, or like an edit icon in the top of an area. Sorry, I'm just going to take a quick drink. Yeah, so WCAG also includes an in-draft understanding document, which sort of goes through and explains some of the intent of the success criterion and other potentially helpful information. I put that link in the slides, and we may also pop that in the chat if we can. And basically the end goal of this entire thing, like the reason why this criterion exists, is to make controls easier to activate. That's the idea. And yeah, that's a very valiant goal, and it's definitely worth pursuing target size. If you're on the fence about it, if you don't have to meet WCAG 2.2, it's still definitely worth doing because you want to make controls easy to activate within your experience. It's also, as I mentioned, it's worth taking a look at the enhanced version of target size, which does recommend that 44 by 44 pixels. And you can read about that also on sort of the WCAG pages. So that enhanced version really is the better one of the two, and it's much more aligned to actual like research done in the field of human-computer interaction about sort of what target size is best for interaction, and sort of produces a good balance between like speed of interaction, reduction of error when actually like selecting an item, and also general size on the screen, because obviously the highest accuracy, highest precision, highest speed interaction would be just the whole screen as a button, the end. But that's not very good for creating a good UI. So, but yeah, so the enhanced version though is sort of much closer aligned to the real world research on how much space is adequate for sort of interacting with controls, especially when talking about a thumb on some sort of touchscreen device. And this is sort of research all the way back from 2006, I think was sort of the first time that research was conducted sort of scientifically for one-handed thumb use on mobile handheld devices with a touch-sensitive screen. And for those who know sort of the tech history, the reason why this might be one of the first versions is because the iPhone, which was sort of the first major commercial success of a touch-sensitive phone, that came out in 2007. So this is pretty much aligned with sort of the beginning of that smartphone touchscreen era. In that research, they found, this is just taken from the abstract specifically, but I've also linked to the full article, the full paper there. It's basically, they found that the ideal target size is between 9.2 millimeters and 9.6 millimeters, depending on the tasks being taken. So yeah, we've got between 9 and 10 millimeters will make for sort of a speedy, precise, and accurate touch target, sort of a best of both worlds on size versus capability there. This slightly presents a problem when you start looking at the actual number of pixels needed to meet that millimeter amount. So on a standard resolution screen, which is basically considered 96 DPI dots per inch, I suppose, you've got 24 pixels equals around 6.4 millimeters. So you're already under that 9 millimeter sort of goal. Whereas the 44 pixel version, which is sort of the AAA WCAG, gets you to 11.6 millimeters. So you're golden there, except for the fact that most smartphone devices, most touchscreens these days are not 96 DPI anymore. So if you've got a decent resolution screen, this is sort of one of the more updated amounts, which is 135 DPI. This is one of the amounts that was recommended in a web.dev article, sort of through Google. With that one, you're getting 4.6 millimeters at the 24 pixel size. So about half of what's recommended there for good interaction. And if you go up to the 44 pixel version, you're still meeting about 8.4 millimeters. So you're just under that sort of sweet spot there. And now if we go to my phone, which is, I think it's iPhone 12 Pro, we've completely collapsed at the 24 pixel size. So 24 pixels gets you 4 millimeters. And I know that is not just a calculation because I actually got like a 24 pixel image on my screen yesterday and I measured it and it was 4 millimeters. So that's all you really got to work with at this point, which is less than half of the recommended. If we go up to 44 pixels, which is sort of the AAA standard for WCAG, you got 7.3 millimeters. So you're still under sort of the recommendation even there. So basically, I've got a haiku for this. So when you can aim above 24 pixels of size and spacing. It's not the greatest haiku, but it is a haiku. But yeah, basically, if you've got the space to do it, go bigger. I would recommend personally up to 48 pixels, and a few other places recommend that as well. But once again, it'll sort of, results may vary. It'll depend on the UI you have and things like that. All right, I'll pass it over to Kelly, and I think we've got some time for questions.
Yeah, I've been collecting the questions that have been raised in the chat whilst you've been talking, David. So I'm going to run through those and then there'll be an opportunity to ask some questions on mic as well, if you would like. So I can see as people have been asking questions in the chat that folks on the call have been answering as well, which is great. Thank you for that. And Charlotte has also been pitching in with some answers too. But I will still run through the questions. So the first question that was sent was, can I confirm that you said by August 2024, websites need to be compliant with the new standard?
Sorry, can you repeat? I'm going to try to find the doc.
Yep. Can I confirm that you said by August 2024, websites need to be compliant with the new standard?
I said 1 year after WCAG 2.2 is released. So if WCAG 2.2 comes out in August, then yes. If it comes out later, then no.
Cool, thank you. There was a question in the chat as well. It says, what does inline text mean?
Yes, so inline text is basically to do, it gets a little technical. It has something to do with different types of HTML elements that you actually would put in a page. So an example would be anything that you could pop into a paragraph and it doesn't sort of mess up the shape of the paragraph, that might be inline. So links, which are A tags in HTML, those are inline. Some lists you can make inline as well, where instead of stacking vertically, which is sort of that second thing to look for, if they stack horizontally and they automatically wrap and stuff like that, that's inline. And span tags, which are sort of a general inline tag to use in HTML, are also inline. So it gets a little technical on what inline means, but basically, like if it naturally wraps inside a paragraph and doesn't mess up a paragraph, that's a good indication that it's inline. So that basically means if you've got a paragraph that's just chock full of links and they're all spilling down to like new lines and stuff, you don't have to calculate the target size between two different links on different lines of like paragraph text. That's inline, that's fine to go as an exception. I will note that doesn't mean they're magically easier to click. It's just an exception that they decide to write into WCAG 2.2.
Well, thanks, David. Another question, do we need special readers to measure the 24 pixel or 24 pixel when testing?
Special readers. I don't know what's meant by special readers. I don't think you would need a screen reader for this because screen readers don't have a visual presentation in that way. I'll get to how we're going to recommend testing later. But as far as special readers, I think the answer would be no.
Thanks. Next question. What if a radio label is close to the control? Can the hit area overlap the text?
So this is, I think, where I've gone into a bit of interpretation. If you have two hit areas that do the same thing and they're overlapping, you can count them as the same thing. So you can sort of combine those two areas. I think it gets a little less clear when they don't overlap. So say you've got a radio, sort of the circle of the radio button, and then you've got the label. And if they're not touching, it gets a bit less clear if they count towards each other. And I mean, general rule of thumb, especially with interactive form elements like radios and checkboxes, things that you definitely want people to be able to activate. Yeah, just make each part of that at least 24 pixels or 44 pixels would be the safest way to go. But yes, I think there's a bit of nuance on if there's two elements that overlap, such as in sort of like a card design, if you've got a link and an image and a background and they're all going to the same place, do they all need to be 24 pixels? Even though the actual like size of it is like, say, 1,000 pixels. I think the answer at that point would be no, they don't all have to be individually 24 pixels because you have a giant area that's all interactable and does the same thing. But yes, it gets a bit more nuance in there, and yeah.
Cool. Thanks, David. I think we probably have time for a couple more questions, but please feel free to keep adding your questions to the chat. I'm recording all of them and we'll be able to answer them after the session as well. So next question, is relying on the default browser input type equals date accessible?
Is relying on the default browser input type. So I think that's one of the exceptions. We haven't quite gotten to that level of detail. I'll just fact check myself before I say it though, which is if you're using the built-in sort of browser or sort of computer or whatever defaults and you're not changing them. So that's called a user agent. Yes, if you're not changing the styling of that at all, that is also one of the exceptions under target size minimum. Important once again to note, that just because it's an exception and you'll pass doesn't mean that it's super easy and interactable. An example, at least on the Gov.UK design system team, is select options, which is sort of a built-in HTML thing. Sometimes they're called like drop downs, or it's basically it drops down and it lets you select from a bunch of different options. And you can scroll through those options. So there's a default of those, but we've actually built sort of our own version. And the same for radio options and checkboxes, because the browser defaults at the time were not very accessible and had very small hit targets. So yes, there is an exception that if you use the user agent, whether that's the device OS or the browser, you'll pass if you don't modify that at all. But thinking from usability perspective and an accessibility perspective, it might be better to go with a robust and tested modified version instead.
Great, thanks, David. Yeah, we've probably got time for one more question. So for target sizes, the ability to touch or click the target is the primary concern over visibility and legibility, at least in terms of WCAG standard. Is that correct?
So you can go to the understanding document for target size to get the exact intent. I'm pretty sure it's in there, but I've interpreted it as the main sort of intent of it is to avoid misclicking or mispressing. So selecting the wrong thing, because this is only really about like the spacing between elements being 24 pixels. There's an exception that makes it so like the actual selection portion, like the target area, could be as small as 1 pixel by 1 pixel and it would still pass. So it's not like a robust way to make sure that everything sort of matches. It's the minimum. So generally the intent for this is to make sure when selecting something, you don't accidentally select something else. Not so much that when selecting something, it'll be easy to click, if that makes sense. And the primary concern is not over visibility or legibility, correct? It is about sort of the touching portion of it, but about not touching the wrong thing, touching the right thing instead. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, David. We'll cap questions there just because of time. But yeah, like I said before, please feel free to keep adding questions into the chat and we'll make a note of them. Thanks all.
All right, I've got a bunch of inspection tips now. And these are basically, as I was making this, I came up with a couple different tips and tricks. So yeah, I'll share those now. So the first one is the browser inspect tools are your friend in this case. This is why we kind of made this whole inspection section for this workshop series, is because some of these do take a bit more of a technical dive into the actual code. if you want to sort of get the exact precise answer on whether something passes or fails. So on Chrome and Edge, you can always use the right click or the context menu, it's called, and then select the inspect option to sort of pull that up. And I'll do a demo of that in a bit. Or you can use something called a bookmarklet, which is basically a bit of injectable code that is saved as a bookmark in a browser, or you can save it as a bookmark in a browser, and then it allows you to, in this case, it would be modified CSS. What's that, David? Oh, look, I made one. This kind of came up as I was trying to find examples for this workshop, is that it was just taking a very long time to even find like failures at all in different websites, because it's just visually, it's hard to see sort of the target area for things, because sometimes it's invisible, sometimes it's the same color as the background, things like that. So I think I'll ask Charlotte if you're able to pull the first, or maybe I can do it, the first link to that in the chat. Maybe I can do it. Oh, you've already got it. Perfect. Yeah, so that's sort of a thing I've slapped together. It's open source, so if there's any errors or improvements, feel free to add to it. But basically, it allows you to press a button in your bookmarks tab and highlight most of the target areas on a page, with a few exceptions due to technical issues. But yes, they help by adding predefined CSS to a page, which will sort of make the unclear or invisible target areas visible. So I've got on the screen right now a before image of our main website, GOV.UK design system, main website for my team at least. And then I'll go to the after. And in the afters one, once you sort of click that button, the regular version we have here puts on green highlights for everything that's sort of just a regular click area, hit area for a target. And then just because I was having fun, it puts rainbow outlines on the ones that are special pseudo element pieces. So they're sort of intentionally made of not real stuff. That is a terrible way to explain that, but basically it is also clickable target area, but it's not from the actual element. It was sort of stuff added to make it bigger, is generally the case with those. So I separated them out because sometimes you can get a false positive with the rainbow ones, with those pseudo elements. So I just wanted to make it clear that these might be target area space. They may not be as well. A note to this as well is bookmarklets won't work on all web pages. That's just a general thing about bookmarklets. For example, they won't work on the main gov.uk website for those content pages. And that's because the developers for that website and others like it have put sort of a restriction on it called a content security policy, which prevents certain attacks from happening to a page. But in general, it also prevents us from using automated tools to update the CSS. So there's two bookmarks in there. There's a basic version that does not work well with images that are also links or images that are also clickable. And there's an advanced version that does work with that, but also may cause some layout shift of the page, move things around, especially when you're like, especially with pseudo elements and like placing things in different spots through CSS. So an example where we sort of see the advanced version breaking down is I've got sort of a sample here of a how do you want to sign in page from a gov.uk example journey. It's got 4 radio options, and in the regular one, the basic clicker, it puts rainbows on the radio option circles, and then if you switch to advanced, it moves them, and they sort of get shoved inside of the space of the labels. So that's not good, but it is really good for sometimes revealing other hidden areas, especially to do with images. So yeah, generally what I've been doing is I'll start with the basic one, see if that works. If there's a place that looks like it's probably clickable and I'm curious, I'll try the advanced one instead. So yeah, that's the bookmarklet sort of idea or solution that we'll go through today as a way to really speed up testing for target size. But it's also important to note that you can start by scanning visually as well. And with something called the 24 pixel circle cursor, which is another bookmarklet not developed by me, developed by two different people, one being Adrian Roselli, and then someone else forked that, someone named Curtis, to make a few different versions as well. So that link to the bookmarklet for target size highlighting also has links to those two pixel cursors, and I'll show that in the demo as well. And then, yeah, when something looks close to 24 pixels, by using that bookmarklet, by using that cursor, that's sort of the indicator that it's worth investigating more thoroughly using that inspect space in your browser. It's also a good idea to check the page at a mobile size screen width when you're looking for this. Some websites and some different applications will have different text sizes or different element sizes depending on the screen width, or depending on whether there's like a mobile browser version as well. Some websites have a mobile specific version, like Wikipedia has one. But if you want to test that without having to move to an actual like mobile device, you can also do that through something called either responsive design mode or device mode. And that can also be accessed usually through the inspect tools in a browser. I've put instructions for 4 browsers in the notes for this slide. So if you want to grab those later, you can. And now we'll go into a demo. So I think I've got 3 pages to go through here. I'm going to keep it nice and short if I can. And we'll see how it goes. So hopefully you can see that. Let me know if you can't. But we've got here sort of, you should be able to see my whole, my whole window here. But we basically got a page up, which is the Gov.UK design system, and showing once again sort of what it looks like. I'm going to start by demoing just the inspect tool and how to go about that, and other just general ways to check for target size. Sorry, excuse me one moment. All right, so we've got here a bunch of pieces, and I'm getting the hand cursor. I don't know if you can see my cursor. It's going to be important that you can, so let me know right now if you can't. But as I sort of scroll over these top sort of like sub menu items here, we get, oh, let me see. You can, excellent. You get a pointer option. It's sort of the hand pointing. So that's another way to just generally see where the target areas are on something without doing anything else. So I can see basically it's this full white area, and then expanded a little bit to the sides is clickable for each of these targets. And then for this get started button, it seems to just be around the button, around the links. It's mostly just around the links, et cetera, et cetera. And now I will show, yeah, we'll go to those bookmarklets. So I've gone to the top, I've got my bookmark toolbar showing here, and I just pressed basic target size 1. And now I've got rainbows around some of these, I've got green highlights around others, and it's generally showing the size and shape of all of those. And now I'm going to start wondering, oh, are those big enough? So one way you can do that is, like I mentioned in that page, we've got, which I should also just pull up. But yeah, we've got these cursors that turn your mouse cursor into sort of a 24 pixel circle. With so you can use that to sort of gauge. The way to do that is sort of place one point of it at sort of the start, and then see how far it goes. So in this case, it looks like it goes a full 24 for these. And then the ones in the footer don't quite meet 24, but they're adequately far enough away from each other in this size. But I'm going to now right click and press inspect. And I'm going to shrink my browser screen down to sort of a mobile size, and I'll see if that's changed. Yes. So now they're smaller a little bit. And if I keep going, we'll notice that they're now sort of in 2 lines here for these footer links: accessibility, sitemap, cookies, and privacy. And if I look with my cursor again, they are starting to overlap now. From the top of the accessibility one to the top of the privacy one, there's not enough space there. However, these are in line, and you can tell that. Well, I just know that, but also as you're like changing, they sort of, they flow with the page, kind of like text. And if we actually go in and inspect them, I'm pretty sure I'm now looking at sort of the inspector in the actual HTML. Yes, this is called the GOV.UK footer inline link list item. So this is actually, there's some CSS code added to make this an inline link. So these do pass based on that inline exception. But it's important to note, they're pretty close together. So just because they pass doesn't mean they're easy to select and doesn't mean that there's a low chance of error there. All right, I'll also show the advanced one just to show sort of what that one looks like on here. There we go. So it's a bit more experimental, which is why it's advanced. So it's been able to do pretty much nothing new, and it actually gets less coverage on these ones at the top here because of that piece where like any sort of pseudo element piece, it pulls inside of the main area. So didn't quite work out this time. Sometimes it's super helpful though. All right, so I'll give another example now. I'll move to the IMDb page I have up here. Oh, look, it's Barbie, wow. So let's take a look at this page and see if there's any new pieces to look at. So don't mind the fact that they've changed the cursor to have a little Barbie symbol following it. If we scroll down this page, there's a lot of interactive elements on this page. A lot. And we've got some overlapping ones as well. And yeah, just generally it's a very busy user interface, which is not bad. But there is a lot to test for target size. So let's get started. I've pressed the basic target size bookmarklet. And as we can see, some of them come up with sort of multiple elements, but if I can, no, I can't, dang it. But when I sort of scroll over them, I'm looking at the bottom left here just to see what URL it is. And both the adventure and the pill shape for this one I'm looking at right now are the same URL, so that's okay. They're all sort of the same hit target. These ones up here, 2023 and 12A, those look pretty small. I'm going to use my circle cursor now to check. Yes, they are not 24 pixels by 24 pixels, but they're not close enough to overlap with each other. So it's okay. And same can be said for this plus over the Barbie. I'm just going to check that it's not, so it is a link. Now the question is it the same link as this? If it was the same, if it goes to the same place, that's fine. If it goes to a different place, there just needs to be that 24 pixels, which in this case, that bookmark is 24 pixels at least. So that's fine to go. Moving down here though, I'll show the one that is here for this example, which is here, I think. So I'll turn off that cursor again. You'll see, oh, where is it? Yes, this is a good example. Up here, I've scrolled to the stars section, and you've got sort of this big card for stars, and it's clickable. But then inside of this stars piece, we have different links for each of the stars. And these links might be wide enough, but they're not tall enough. So as far as I can tell, these would fail the target size AA level. So we'd either need to make those bigger or take them out of this. There's a bunch of different ways to change it. And I'll add the caveat as I'm going through this and potentially finding fails. It's not really something that is like a moral failing at this point because this is sort of a new regulation or a new sort of guideline. So while it's great if this is sort of beforehand, a lot of people haven't been looking at this because it is net new stuff. And there's always time to fix it. Yeah, so this one has a bunch of those though, where you've got sort of like a clickable giant area, and then you've got inside that you've got sort of a link to something else. So that would be something to take a look at and likely fix. Yeah, and there's just so much stuff on this page. But yeah, so that's an example there. And then I'll go to one more. So this is a page from Gov.UK, and I just wanted to show that none of the bookmarklets work. So in this case, if you're onto this, there is still a way to check it with the bookmarklet if you really, really want to, or you can just manually inspect by like right-clicking on stuff, pressing inspect. And then when you go inside, you can hover over each of the pieces in that sort of HTML elements list, and it will show the size. But hold on, it's not quite accurate because it's going by an individual element size, and some target areas can be made of multiple elements, which is why I made that bookmark in the first place. So let's go down to say government activity down here. Because these are not inline links, this is a vertical list of links. So these would count if they don't quite make it. But let's see how much space is in between each of these. So we've got a list item, it's 16 pixels high. And then if I go down to this computed sort of extra area, we'll see that there's a 15 pixel margin on that. And if I scroll through each of these, I can see that the margin does sort of pad out each of them. So 16 plus 15 is 31. So each of these gets 31 sort of target spacing vertically. So these are fine, but that's another way to do this as well. If you don't have access to the bookmarklet or anything like that, is you can rely on sort of looking at where the pointer is. So as I scroll over, you can see that, and also relying on hovering through this sort of elements list here. And then I will also show how you can put the target size stuff in there, although that might just take me a quick second to pull up my code for that. So I've saved this so that I can do this demo, but basically I've got all the code individually input as CSS here. So what I'm going to do is I'll take the CSS selectors, which is a bunch of them for this bookmarklet, and I'm going to paste them in. Maybe I'll just do it on a link somewhere, this benefits link. So I'll inspect that. And then in the styles area of this inspector, I'm going to add a new selector. I'll paste that in. Looks like I didn't quite get it right. There we go. So it's just a bunch of what are CSS selectors, which are basically select X thing, and then I'll put the attributes, which are do these things to that list of selected things. So I'll paste that in, and we should see, there we go. So we've got the rainbow sort of pseudo element one coming up now. And then we'll do the same for the non-pseudo element one, which is once again a list of a bunch of things that we want to select. I'll add that again. And then I will add these. There we go. So now I've added these styles to a gov.uk page that wouldn't allow me to use the bookmarklet. And as you can see with this, each of these sort of accordion items gets plenty of space, huge target area. The links, I think I don't have the circle pixel to help me out, but they're slightly less than 24 pixels, but there's nothing around them and they'll be in line. And these at the bottom, once again, the ones down here in the bottom of the footer are in line, so those are good. And there seems to be good spacing between everything else. I'll check the menu as well. This, once again, uses pseudo elements to sort of expand the size of those pieces. So that's why you're seeing a bunch of rainbows. And they all look nice and well-sized and far away from each other. So it's all good to go. So we'll go into types of fixes available. So once you've identified that, yes, there's something wrong here, we've got to get this slightly bigger than that 24 pixel spacing. The one I would recommend is make stuff bigger. So that's sort of the easiest one to do is if you've got something that's small, well, make it bigger. Not much more to explain there. You can also make things further apart. So that's taking advantage of that exception for spacing, where if they're 24 pixels away from each other from like the center of the item, 12 pixels out either side, sort of that circle radius around them. It's really hard to explain. It's easier to just see it though. If there's like from the center of the item, you've got a radius out of 12 pixels in all directions, you're good to go. And then the other one is make stuff not overlap. So like in that one we saw with the IMDb Barbie page, you had overlapping elements where there was like multiple interactive things on top of each other. And if you like click on one area, you're fine. If you click on the other, you go somewhere else. Yeah, one way to fix that is to make things not overlap. I'll go into the exceptions now, and this covers some of the stuff that we sort of hinted at before. And I'll just cover, I've split it into like 4 exceptions when technically there's 5, the 5th being spacing. but the way it's written, spacing is basically part of the rule. It's not so much an exemption, just on the way that it's written. So the 4 that are definitely like full exceptions, like use these if you need to sort of thing. But once again, just because they pass because of an exception doesn't mean they're easier to use. So exception A is have a second control option. We talked about that. Have an alternative sort of on the same page. Exception B, have the stuff be inline. So once again, with those paragraphs, there's sort of the exception carved out for that. The other one is use the user agent default. So that one we've also talked about, where if it's sort of the browser default or the operating system default, don't change it at all, and you're good to go as far as WCAG is concerned. Once again, doesn't mean it's more accessible though. And the last one is sometimes you have no other choice. Things need to be spaced the way they are. They need to be sized the way they are for it to make sense. So yeah, once again, examples are maps, color pickers, pieces like that, where the size and location are intrinsic important information. Tips when fixing. So these are sort of, once again, this isn't part of WCAG anymore. This is just sort of advice being given. Make it easy to use, not passable. So try to make it so that your user interface, your interactive pieces are easy to use. Don't just go for, hey, it passes, good to go. Consider both sizing and spacing when going through it. So don't just look at solutions that are all spacing. And also, yeah, think about like, even if you have a bunch of interactive elements and they're all 24 pixels, if they're all like just touching and stuff, it may not be easy to use still. So you might want to consider adding spacing anyhow, just to give a bit more of like a grace space in between each of the pieces. And then there's a design principle I put in here called be consistent, not uniform. And that sort of says like, if you're gonna choose sort of a size for things, find a way to sort of make that like a consistent experience. So an example would be like on pagination links, sort of on like a search page. Ideally, you wouldn't have one of them be 24 pixels, one of them be 74 pixels, one of them be 13 pixels. You'd go for something where sort of the sizing of each of these is predictable and easy to sort of understand or intuit from the interface. And then, as always, when in doubt, test. So if any of this is putting up like red flags or concerns, one way to resolve that is through testing with real people. Ideally, people that are sort of the target audience for the thing you're making, and people also including disabled people in testing as well. I've got a cheeky rule of thumb for this one as well, which is the rule of thumb is think about navigating with a thumb. So as you're going through and creating, so this is sort of for designers and stuff, as you're going through and creating a user interface or sort of an experience, think about navigating that entire journey with just one thumb. How would you do that? How would that change the way that you lay things out? Because that's a very real way people are going to go through your service. There's a caveat to that, especially in some like advanced dashboards and stuff. You might know exactly the environment where it's being used at all times. Say your system can only be used from one console in one place, and everyone always uses it on desktop sort of thing. But also consider then, is that creating a problem in case it would ever want to expand? So is this advanced system only used on desktops with like super precise mouses because of the way it's designed? And is there space to improve it even still? Because if you're just designing for, say, power users in that sort of space, it's going to be much more difficult for newcomers to use that. Yeah, so always sort of find a balanced way to deliver sort of the UI needs, that precision and speed for power spaces, while also considering usability and comfort. And still, even if it's internal service, if you work for the government, at least, it has to meet WCAG AA. So you're going to have to meet the target size even in those spaces. All right. So that is the end of my piece, and we're just right on the hour, which is great. So I'm going to hand it over to Kelly now to explain the activity.
Okay, so yeah, we've come towards to the end of today's workshop. Just a massive thank you for participating today and taking part in the activity. But before we finish, we have got time for a few more questions. So if you do have a question for our team, can you please use the raise hand feature, and we will do our best to answer them now. though. I think, Mart, I think you put your hand up first, and then we'll go to Alex.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's one thing that came up in the site we were looking at in my group. There was a list of links, three links, and a little list at the top of the content of the page, and those links were set up as span tags rather than semantically they should have been in an actual list, because they look like a list and acted like a list. But it being in span tag, would that be picked up as a fail, or would they be leaking through as a pass because they're supposedly in line?
So I'll speak to Becky then, don't worry.
Thanks, Mart. David, you're able to answer that question?
All right. Oh boy, this is a fun one. So this is where I would say apologies in advance, but open up that understanding document for target size. They do have like a very specific definition for what inline is in this case, and it's very not clear. So I think generally, yeah, if inline links are being used as inline links should, then it makes a lot of sense. But if not, it does become a little bit more complex than that. So yeah, it says the exception is specifically for inline targets in sentences, or sort of within like a paragraph as it sort of flows, or where the size of the target is constrained by the line height of non-target text, which is where it gets a bit more dense. I think, I don't know specifically which one you're talking about, but basically this is where that, like, the thing that gets affected is stacked elements. This sounds like a stacked element case. I would probably make the ruling of just better safe than sorry. It does sort of sound like they're using span incorrectly. So you got to sort of throw out the idea at that point of like, oh, if it's a span, it's fine, because they're not doing span properly. But yeah, basically, it sounds like it's not constrained by the line height of the non-target text, which is to say, like, it's not like text in a straight line with a line height, and then suddenly it just keeps going with that same line height. It sounds like it's sort of like entering to a new line there to create sort of a list.
It was worse than that. There was line breaks added in with the BR tag.
Yeah, so that would be breaking the line height if there's actual like BR line breaks. So it wouldn't be under the exception anymore, as far as I understand it. But this is the more vague, dense part. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Mart, and thanks, David. I think we probably have time for one more question. If you do have a question we can't get to it, please just add it into the chat and we'll make a note of it and answer them after the session. Alex, I think you were second.
Thank you very much. Yeah, hi, Alex. I'm a UX designer here. Thanks very much. This has been really great. My first question you've kind of already answered there, because it was a similar one around when text links are exempt and when they're not. And it sounds, you've given us a couple of tips there to kind of make a judgment call on that. The one other question that's probably more pressing then in that case is, how about instances where you allow the user to create their own content, and they might be setting their own colors which fail contrast, they might be setting their own text that's too small, that kind of thing? How do the guidelines cover things like that for user generated content? Is that considered exempt? And like, how far as designers do we need to kind of move towards helping them make content more accessible, or whether it's completely down to the person designing it? Got any thoughts on that?
Do have thoughts, and I'm putting a link in the chat very soon. So to say, if you're looking for whether that's covered under WCAG 2.2, the answer is you might be able to find a place, but it's not explicit on it. I know WCAG 3, which is sort of a future version, is bringing in some stuff about user-generated content specifically. But for now, the place to look for that is actually a different set of recommendations called the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines. So that's sort of like, if you have a content management system, if you have some sort of like social media or like microblogging or blogging platform, it's a set of guidelines on how to make those accessible that talks about user-generated content. Basically, it's like follow WCAG plus this extra stuff, like you were just saying. So I think that answers your question already. But But ATAG, so the authoring tool stuff, I don't think is currently covered by most like laws and stuff like that. That being said, something doesn't need to be a law to be a good idea for accessibility and a good idea for usability. So I definitely recommend looking through there. And I think you're already starting to hit on some of the evident ones, like making it easy to enter alt text, giving nudges for that is a way to do it, making it so that there's like a constrained palette of colors for text so that you don't get contrast issues. All that sort of stuff is covered under like helping people generate accessible content.
Yeah, marvelous. I've not come across that link before. It's completely new to me, so it sounds like that will be well worth the read. Cheers.
Great. Thank you, David. And thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone, for your questions. Okay, we're going to bring the session to a close now. So we just wanted to share some more resources that you might find useful after today's session. This is the Web Accessibility Initiative, what's new in WCAG 2.2 draft. I think Charlotte is going to be sharing these links in the chat as I run through them. So this is an informational page that's been created by the Web Accessibility Initiative, who are the people who make WCAG. There is a blog post as well, which is relevant to this, updating the GOV.UK homepage. There's a quote here from the blog post that says, "We've developed a new reusable page element shown below. This provides a much larger touch target when tapping on links," and we'll post a link to that blog post in the chat. Here is a useful summary article called Foundations Target Sizes. This post explores how to create usable, consistent and well-spaced target sizes. Again, we will post that link in the chat. And a conference paper from 2006 titled Target Size Study for One-Handed Thumb Use on Small Touchscreen Devices. This paper describes a two-phase study conducted to determine optimal target sizes for one-handed thumb use on mobile handheld devices equipped with a touch-sensitive screen. Again, that link will go into the chat. You can also take a look at our team's GitHub tickets. They're part of our work to update to 2.2, and that's us updating the design system guidance and the front-end code base. We'll share those links as well. So that, brings us to the end of today's session. But all that's left to say is just a massive thank you for joining and participating in this workshop. And a big thanks to David and Charlotte as well for joining me in facilitating it. And please enjoy the rest of your day.